Section 8 of G.K. Chesterton's newspaper columns, The New Witness, 1921. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. G.K. Chesterton's newspaper columns, The New Witness, 1921, by G.K. Chesterton. At the sign of the world's end, the march to Main Street. There was a time when the progress of the city seemed to mock the decay of the country. It is more and more true, I think, today, that it is rather the decay of the cities that seem to poison the progress and promise of the countryside. The cinema boasts of being a substitute for the tavern, but I think it a very bad substitute. I think so, quite apart from the question about fermented liquor. Nobody enjoys cinema more than I, but to enjoy them a man has only to look and not even to listen, and in a tavern he has to talk. Occasionally, I admit, he has to fight, but he need never move with the movies. Thus, in the real village inn are the real village politics, while in the other are only the remote and unreal metropolitan politics. And those central city politics are not only cosmopolitan politics, but corrupt politics. They corrupt everything that they reach, and this is the real point about many perplexing questions. For instance, so far as I am concerned, it is the whole point about feminism and the factory. It is very largely the point about feminism and many other callings apparently more cultured than the factory, such as the law court and the political platform. When I see women so wildly anxious to tie themselves to all this machinery of the modern city, my first feeling is not indignation, but that dark and ominous sort of pity with which we should see a crowd rushing to embark in a leaking ship under a lowering storm. When I see wives and mothers going in for business government, I not only regard it as a bad business, but as a bankrupt business. It seems to me very much as if the peasant women, just before the French Revolution, had insisted on being made duchesses, or, as is quite as logical and likely, on being made dukes. It is as if those ragged women, instead of crying out for bread, had cried out for powder and patches. By the time they were wearing them, they would be the only people wearing them, for powder and patches soon went out of fashion. But bread does not go out of fashion. In the same way, if women desert the family for the factory, they may find they have only done it for a deserted factory. It would have been very unwise of the lower orders to claim all the privileges of the higher orders in the last days of the French monarchy. It would have been very laborious to learn the science of heraldry or the tables of precedence when all such things were at once most complicated and most moribund. It would be tiresome to be taught all those tricks just when the whole bag of tricks was coming to an end. A French satirist might have written a fine epilogue about Jacques Bonhomme coming up to Paris in his wooden shoes and demanding to be made gold stick in waiting in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But I fear the stick in waiting would be waiting still. One of the first topics on which I heard conversation turning in America was that of a very interesting book called Main Street, which involves many of these questions of the modern industrial and the eternal feminine. It is simply the story, or perhaps rather the study than the story, of a young married woman in one of the multitudinous little towns on the great central plains of America, and of a sort of struggle between her own more restless culture and the provincial prosperity of her neighbors. There are a number of true and telling suggestions in the book, but the one touch which I found tingling in the memory of many readers was the last sentence, in which the master of the house, with unshaken simplicity, merely asked for the whereabouts of some domestic implement. I think it was a screwdriver. It seems to me a harmless request, but from the way people talked about it, one might suppose he had asked for a screwdriver to screw down the wife in her coffin, and a great many advanced persons would tell us that the wooden house in which she lived really was like a wooden coffin. But this appears to me to be taking a somewhat funereal view of the life of humanity. For after all, on the face of it at any rate, This is merely the life of humanity, and even the life which all humanitarians have striven to give to humanity. Revolutionists have treated it not only as the normal, but even as the ideal. Revolutionary wars have been waged to establish this. Revolutionary heroes have fought, and revolutionary martyrs have died, only to build such a wooden house for such a worthy family. Men have taken the sword and perished by the sword in order that the poor gentleman might have liberty to look for his screwdriver. For there is here a fact about America that is almost entirely unknown in England. The English have not in the least realized the real strength of America. We in England hear a great deal. We hear far too much about the economic energy of industrial America, about the money of Mr. Morgan, or the machinery of Mr. Edison. We never realize that while we in England suffer from the same sort of success in capitalism and clockwork, we have not got what the Americans have got, something at least to balance it in the way of a free agriculture, a vast field of free farms dotted with small freeholders. For the reason I shall mention in a moment, they are not perhaps in the fullest and finest sense a peasantry, but they are in the practical and political sense a pure peasantry, in that their comparative equality is a true counterweight to the toppling injustice of the towns. And even in places like that described as Main Street, that comparative equality can immediately be felt. The men may be provincials, but they are certainly citizens. They consult on a common basis, and I repeat that in this, after all, they do achieve what many prophets and righteous men have died to achieve. This plain village, fairly prosperous, fairly equal, untaxed by tyrants, and untroubled by wars, is, after all, the place which reformers have regarded as their aim, when reformers have used their wits sufficiently to have any aim. The march to Utopia, the march to earthly paradise, the march to the New Jerusalem has been very largely the march to Main Street. And the latest modern sensation is a book written to show how wretched it is to live there. All this is true, and I think the lady might be more contented in her coffin, which is more comfortably furnished than most of the coffins where her fellow creatures live. Nevertheless, there is an answer to this, or at least modification of it. There is a case for the lady and a case against the gentleman and the screwdriver. And when we have noted what it really is, we have noted the real disadvantage in a situation like that of modern America, and especially the Middle West. And with that we come back to the truth with which I started this speculation, the truth that few have yet realized, but of which I, for one, am more and more convinced, that industrialism is spreading because it is decaying, that only the dust and ashes of its dissolution are choking up the growth of natural things everywhere, and turning the green world gray. In this relative agricultural equality, the Americans of the Middle West are far in advance of the English of the 20th century. It is not their fault if they are still some centuries behind the English of the Middle Ages. But the defect by which they fall short of being a true peasantry is that they do not produce their own spiritual food, in the same sense as their own material food. They do not, like some peasantries, create other kinds of culture besides the kind called agriculture. Their culture comes from the great cities, and that is where all the evil comes from. If a man had gone across England in the Middle Ages, or even across Europe in more recent times, he would have found a culture which showed its vitality by its variety. We know the adventures of the three brothers in the old fairy tales who passed across the endless plain from city to city and found one kingdom ruled by a wizard and another wasted by a dragon, one people living in castles of crystal and another sitting by fountains of wine. These are but legendary enlargements of the real adventures of a traveler passing from one patch of peasantry to another, and finding women wearing strange headdresses and men singing new songs. A traveler in America would be somewhat surprised if he found the people in the city of St. Louis all wearing crowns and crusading armor in honor of their patron saint. He might even feel some faint surprise if he found all the citizens of Philadelphia clad in a composite costume combining that of a Quaker with that of a Red Indian, in honor of the noble treaty of William Penn. Yet these are the sort of local and traditional things that would really be found, giving variety to the valleys of medieval Europe. I myself felt a perfectly genuine and generous exhilaration of freedom and fresh enterprise in new places like Oklahoma. But you would hardly find in Oklahoma what was found in Oberammergau. What goes to Oklahoma is not the peasant play, but the cinema. And the objection to the cinema is not so much that it goes to Oklahoma as that it does not come from Oklahoma. In other words, these people have on the economic side a much closer approach than we to economic freedom. It is not for us, who have allowed our land to be stolen by squires and then vulgarized by sham squires, to sneer at such colonists as merely crude and prosaic. They at least have really kept something of the simplicity and therefore the dignity of democracy, and that democracy may yet save their country even from the calamities of wealth and science. But while these farmers do not need to become industrial in order to become industrious, they do tend to become industrial insofar as they become intellectual. Their culture, and to some extent their creed, do come along the railroads from the great modern urban centers and bring with them a blast of death and a reek of rotting things. It is that influence that alone prevents the Middle West from progressing towards the Middle Ages. End of section 8.